What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Canadian Football Fanatics YouTube channel, and thank you guys for tuning in to another video. We got a CFL Combine Recap coming up on today's video. We're going to be joined by 3DownNation's JC Abbott, who has spent the last 3 days in Regina covering the Combine, getting an up-close look at this year's prospects, and we'll be having him on here shortly. He is actually joining us from, I believe, traveling back to BC. So we appreciate JC for taking the time during his busy travel back out west. Hopefully he arrives safe and sound. So before we get into today's guest and today's video, we got two ad reads, of course, by Area 51 Sports to start. So this episode is brought to you by Area 51 Sports, your one-stop shop for all your football needs. Whether you're looking for top-notch footballs, helmets, shoulder pads, cleats, gloves, flag football gear, or even custom uniforms, Area 51 Sports has got you covered. Trusted by athletes at every level, they're dedicated to helping you play at your best. Gear up and dominate the field with Area 51 Sports. Visit their website today, area51sports.ca, and take your game to the next level. And of course, that is one of two ad reads on today's video. We are also sponsored and presented by the Senior Men's Canadian National Football Team. Your Senior Men's Canadian National Football Team needs your support as they gear up to represent Canada in Europe this April, for a big game against Team Italy. Help the boys bring home the win by checking out the fundraising options and official team merchandise at footballcanada.com. Every purchase and donation goes directly to supporting the team on their journey. Let's show the world what Canadian football is all about. Head to footballcanada.com today and help the team make us proud. So, as always, shout out to Area 51 Sports and shout out to the Senior Men's Canadian National Football Team for being our partners on today's video. They have obviously been with us for a few shows now. I was just actually checking it out. We are almost up to 10 shows now presented by the Senior Men's Canadian National Football Team, and they're going to be taking on Team Italy, as I was mentioning, in a few weeks. I believe April 13th, if I'm not mistaken. You guys can follow their Instagram page, the Senior Men's Canadian National Football Team, and they'll have more details over there for you guys. So let's bring in our guest right now, who has been in Regina the past few days covering the CFL's Combine, one JC Abbott from 3DownNation. JC, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
Hey, it's my pleasure as always. I'm doing great.
Awesome, JC. So, how's Regina been? How's the Combine been? Has it been nice?
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, this is always one of my weekends of the year, getting a chance to, see people that you don't necessarily get to see throughout the off season or in the season, reconnect with people from all the teams, all the agents, get to know all these new players. So it's a lot of fun, and the football on display on the field was absolutely fantastic as well.
Yeah, so before we get into the football on the field, let's maybe start back Friday when the testing results kind of started to be happening and stuff. And maybe who are some athletes and prospects that impressed you from that standpoint?
Well, I think there's a number of guys who are just absolutely physical freaks, and some of them just stood on pro day numbers. Guys like Darian Newell and Devin Verisuk, who we already knew that they were just absolutely explosive when it came to the underwear Olympics portion of the weekend. But there's some guys that I thought really helped themselves. Max von Muhldorfer, the defensive tackle from Western, he was a guy who doesn't have the same level of production as Darian Newell, but tested actually very similarly to him at the same size. So I was very impressed by the way he moved. Didn't necessarily expect that. And somebody like Seth Hundeby, the linebacker from Saskatchewan, you're talking about a guy who's 251 pounds. That's way larger than your typical CFL linebacker comes in through the draft process. And he's running a 6.88 in the 3-cone and a 4.7 in the 40. Those are receiver numbers out here at the CFL Combine. And he's doing it at 250 pounds. So that was a super impressive result to me.
you talked about, athletic freaks and stuff like that, and that can kind of come with, when the pads go on. And Saturday morning, I believe the pads go on for practice. And also, that could be, a opportunity for a skill position player to take advantage of. They have the same speed, without pads or with pads. So maybe talk about kind of who are the some prospects that impressed you there on Saturday afternoon when the pads came on.
I think there's a number of guys, for the skill positions. This is an incredibly deep defensive back class. I would argue one of the deepest defensive back classes I've ever seen. A guy who might normally be a third round, fourth round prospect, DB 3 or 4 on your board, is going to be DB 9 this year and be fighting for an eighth round draft spot. It is that good. So guys like Jackson Findlay and Nate Boschemang came as advertised. Anton Hay from Laval really impressed me, and I think a lot of people are sleeping on Mac Bannatyne from Alberta, who I really like on film and I thought was just as good this weekend as well. So those are the guys that stood out. It's a weaker receiver class, but Ethan Jordan, I think, is the class of it. Answered some questions in terms of just how much better he is than the other guys available by running a 4.44 and just looking natural out there on the field. And then in the trenches, the defensive line group was as advertised. But I think on the offensive line, Arvid Hassani from UBC really separated himself as a guy who has the potential to play at the next level and be sort of in that top tier and what is a generally weaker offensive line class from a U Sports perspective, at least.
Yeah, so now that the combine is over and you've had a chance to maybe digest it a little bit at least, I know you're fresh off just coming, JC, but this is a good opportunity for prospects to rise up the board, so to say. So maybe who are some of the prospects that have done that and rised up your board after the combine?
I think it's a lot of the names that I mentioned already. I'll focus in maybe a little bit more on somebody like Anton Hay, who, um, you know, I think was viewed largely as a special teams guy, but his testing numbers are as good as anybody. Really showed how fluid and quick his hips can be. Does he have a higher projection now? I think he does. Hassani really cemented himself there, and then there's always the other guys that answered some questions that weren't maybe as highly regarded. Somebody like Ethan Pyle, the invitational offensive lineman from Guelph, who's extremely undersized, unfortunately, and that's his limitation. The tape's very good, but you don't know how he handles size. I thought showed very well in all of his one-on-one reps. So that's going to give some teams some comfort later in the draft to take a guy who has maybe one aspect of his game that's extremely deficient in the fact that he's just not as big as everybody else, but showed that he can go up against the best of them.
So unfortunately, when the pads come on, there's injuries and stuff like that playing at a fast speed.
Mm-hmm.
I know there was a few injuries that were reported. Jeremiah Ojo, Eric Anderson, I believe, concussion and stuff like that. Is there any others that you can touch on? Maybe like an injury report from the combine now.
Yeah, I think we came out of today reasonably clean. I don't have a full report. There's always guys who, aren't announced or maybe don't have as prominent an agent or an agent who's not there, so you don't necessarily learn about it. But it was a much safer day today, and fortunately, the injuries that happened on Saturday are largely not serious. I think the most serious one is Eric Anderson, who suffered a concussion, as you mentioned. That's really unfortunate for that young man who's, well regarded as a top offensive line prospect and a guy who could, potentially get first round interest in this draft to not be able to showcase himself. I don't think it's going to hurt him in the eyes of teams, but certainly concussions are a scary thing. And fortunately, it's his first one of his career, but you never like to see that happen. And that's why a lot of agents and players are a lot more wary on this particular format than the teams are. We love the ability to see them with their pads on and getting into contract drills. I think it's really valuable, but there is a significant risk for these guys who are about to take the next step in their pro football careers and finally cash a paycheck, that they could suffer an injury that potentially limits them at the next level or affects them for life.
Last time we chatted with you, JC, you talked very highly of being able to see Taylor Ellersma in person, and obviously everyone likes to talk about Rourke and Ellersma at the top of this quarterback class, but there's a lot of depth that comes with the Canadian quarterback class this year. You talk about being able to see Arnaud Desjardins and Jonathan Senecal up close, and then of course we got the interesting news that Jackson Chajinski was going to be taking a lot of his reps at receiver and stuff, and just what a prospect he might be, and kind of what an opportunity he had this weekend.
Yeah, I'll start with Desjardins and Senecal. I think they came as advertised. I'm not convinced that either of those guys are going to be a draftable prospect, but they've certainly been elite U Sports quarterbacks. They showed their touch and their accuracy throughout the week. And is it possible that they get brought into a camp as a non-counter or a camp arm? I think that's entirely plausible for those guys. They certainly did everything in their power and ability to stand out. And Senecal is a unique athlete as well in terms of his change of direction ability. And then for Tuchinski, I think he struggled at times making the adjustment to receiver, but he also showed some flashes. It's certainly a big jump, and he's never done it before. He's doing it against the best competition in the country for the very first time. You have to give the young man kudos for that and being open to that possibility. I think there are teams late in the draft that will see the potential upside there for an athlete like that, who is so raw, but so willing to learn. The problem is, can he crack a roster early on? Because if you're not willing to keep him around to develop him this year as a practice roster guy, you're going to end up sending him back to Manitoba. And if you send him back to Manitoba, I think it's unlikely that the Bisons are going to, switch him to receiver full time when he's the Canada West MVP at quarterback. They've got to do what's best for them. So you lose a year of that development, and essentially he would go back to, ground zero, starting over in his second year. So that's the problem with making that conversion, but there is some upside there.
You talk about another prospect, Darian Newell out of Queens. Was a prospect that, a little bit of kind of chatter about him going into the combine, just starting to pick up, and then there was a lot of chatter on Saturday morning there when the pads came on. He showed very dominant fashion. He unfortunately had to bow out, I think, early due to some family difficulties. But talk about just seeing him and what he is maybe as a prospect to you.
Yeah, it was a legitimate departure for Darian Newell. It's not injury related, and it was for personal reasons. So no team's going to hold it against him. It's not a case of a guy who thought he was too big for the event or something. It was a legitimate situation that he had to go attend to, and he showed everything that he needed to on Saturday morning. Anyway, frankly, if he had been able to stick around, I don't know if it would have been worth it for him to even suit up on Sunday. He is clearly the class of this defensive line group, certainly the interior defensive line, but I would say anywhere on the defensive line of the combine guys, he's got special, unique power. I think every time he was on there for inside run before he had to leave, he was disruptive, creating penetration into the backfield. There wasn't a center or a guard who could handle him properly in that period, and he tests like a freak. So Darren Newell's done everything in this process he needs to prove himself to CFL teams, and frankly, I think he's a guy who deserves an NFL opportunity. Whether that comes or not is to be determined. But if I was an NFL team, I would be strongly looking at the defensive lineman from Queens.
So a question for you about the weekend and Regina as host. The facilities have been beautiful and stuff like that, and just maybe just your experience at the combine. I know you've attended a few.
Yeah, it was an extremely well-run event. I thought from the CFL's perspective, this is the third year that the Combine has been in this particular multi-day format in terms of testing on one day and practices on the others. I think they've really refined it and perfected it. The first year was too long. They shortened it up. Last year, there was some sloppiness to the way it was run, maybe in terms of how the drills were scheduled and things like that. That was not a problem at all this year. I think they nailed it. with what they were doing and the timing of drills and the amount of work they were giving these guys and making sure that they were warming up properly and getting the rest and not being forced to warm up a second time and put their bodies at risk that way. So really well run from that perspective. The facility was great. Unfortunately, unlike last year where it was a facility where you had the ability to move around the whole field from the upper deck, we were stuck in one end of the end zone. So with the DBs and the receivers on the opposite end of the field, it was a little hard to get a full sense of them and their numbers or what they were doing on a day to day just because of the distance. But that's just an inherent limitation of the facility. That's nothing against the CFL and their setup. So I thought it was really well done from their perspective, and hopefully they continue wherever the combine is next year with this type of event.
I think I know the answer to this, JC, because of the facilities around and because of the BC Lions practice facility situation. But would you ever see Vancouver hosting a combine?
I think anything is possible, particularly with Amar Doman and what he has done in order to you know, bid for events and put money into that program. But really, the only place you could host it properly, in my mind, is in BC Place, which is a significant chunk of change. And it's also a little bit difficult when you're flying guys in from all across the country to put it on one coast or the other, right? Because now all of a sudden the travel becomes more extreme for guys. When you're in the middle of the country, it makes sense because it's sort of a halfway point for everybody. It makes some sense if you're out in Ontario because there are more guys out east than out west. But I do think there are challenges when you're putting it on the far west coast because then virtually everyone has to travel a significant distance. I'd love to see it. I think Doman would do a great job hosting it. I think it would be cool to have it in an actual stadium, but I don't see it happening in the near future and certainly not next year.
With talking about the BC Lions, JC, I'm just curious if I know you guys, well, I guess you and Hodge, or mostly, I guess, Hodge, but with your consent, released the mock draft the other week there. And you guys, Jackson Finley has kind of been talked about and stuff like that. Just a quick outlook on the BC Lions going into the upcoming draft and potentially on the insight on the losing pick situation.
Yeah, everyone I've spoken to believes it's a done deal. They're hammering out the official auditing numbers right now. We should have some answers on that in the next couple of weeks. But both sides seem to be preparing as if Calgary will be getting an additional first round pick and BC will be losing theirs because of the cap situation. So I would anticipate not having that selection if you're a Lions fan and looking at some of the guys that are second round prospects. The good thing is for the Lions, this is a draft where you probably want to pick more in the second round than the first. I think it's not necessarily as loaded with top end surefire first rounders who you're going to trade up to go and get, but there is a lot of depth in terms of guys who are going to be contributors on a CFL roster who are going to fall into that second round, third round range. And that's where the Lions have a nice bevy of picks because they did get their additional second rounder. They got one through the VA trade, and then they got another one because they played the most Canadian snaps last year. So they've got 3 picks in the top 20 in that latter half of the top 20, which, in my opinion, is the prime position in this draft.
So with talking about the draft a little bit more, I'm curious, and I know I believe Connor Shea was mock number 1, but there's not really a consensus number 1 pick that's kind of been talked about. Who do you think maybe, or is there a few names that you kind of maybe would consider that Calgary should be considering at number 1?
Yeah, I think Connor Shea obviously is one, or any of those linebackers. They have a need there. If you fall in love with somebody like a Devin Verasek because of his athleticism, maybe that's a candidate. But I think Shea is the top linebacker for a reason, and that's where I would go. But they do need some depth at receiver or a guy who can be in that rotation with Clark Barnes and Jalen Philpott, because both of those two guys have struggled with injuries in the past. So maybe you look at a guy like Damian Alford, who did not produce on the field last year at Utah, but was a good player at Syracuse and at 6'6", 224 pounds, just ran a 4.46 at the Big 12 Pro Day. I think he's a legitimate candidate there. I think Keelan White from Montana is a legitimate candidate there. And I think there are candidates along the defensive line as well. Guys like Newell and guys like Ali Saad from Bowling Green that could potentially fill a need there as well. Um, I would lean Shea personally, just looking at the way that roster is constructed. But I think they have a bevy of options, and right now they're probably looking at five or even six candidates for that top pick.
I know I saw you and Hodge talking about kind of where you see the, I guess, game on for the quarterbacks, them being Eldersma and Rourke at kind of that 5 selection onwards. Where do you kind of see them possibly going and some teams that could be interested?
Yeah, I think they'll be latter half of the first round, early second. I can't see them getting past that because you're not going to see either of those guys early on. I think teams will pass on them in the front portion of the draft because those are typically the teams that are have a desperate need. But if you're a team with good Canadian depth who was a winner last year, or you're using your second pick because you have additional first rounders, that becomes very, very attractive to take a bet on a guy who potentially could be a future CFL starter. Um, I look at Winnipeg as an option. I look at Calgary with their bevy of early picks as an option as well. And Toronto, I think, particularly for El Gurzma, would be a really, really good spot because he's been with that team multiple times in training camp. He's got a built in relationship there. They were giving him legitimate reps in those training camps and to help develop him. And Mike Miller, their QB coach, who's potential future OC somewhere in the CFL, um, really, really likes Taylor Elgersma and was talking to his NCAA connections about potentially getting him down there last year. So when you put all those things together, I wonder if the Argos, with their later first round pick, take El Gurzma as the heir apparent to Chad Kelly.
I asked you this last time, JC, and I'm curious if there's at least any whispers this time. Do you have any insight on possibly a new CFL commissioner?
I don't. I think they're later in that process now than they have been. I flew in late on Thursday, so I missed the whole portion of the day that where the CFLPA was in town to present and all those things. So I didn't necessarily get those conversations. A lot of people were gone by the time I got into town. But I think we will start to hear something as we get towards the season. They're down, I've been told, to you know, the finalist candidates, the 5 or 6 guys that they consider legitimate for the position. I don't know any of those names at this time, but they are in that interview process now where they weren't just a few weeks ago.
Awesome. Appreciate you so much, JC. Let the people know where they can find your work.
Yeah, you can find my work on 3Down Nation. We are always putting out new articles, and I'll have a risers and fallers piece probably by tomorrow morning on the combine. And then you can follow me on Twitter at the JC Abbott. That's the best place to find my work.
Awesome. Appreciate you, buddy, and get back home safe.
Will do. Thanks for having me on.
Yes. That was one JC Abbott joining us once again, coming from the CFL's National Combine. Appreciate JC so much joining us as always. Looking forward to it, folks. This is kind of this is it now. This is the final rundown to the CFL Draft, which is about a month away by the time this is uploaded. And once the CFL Draft is a month away, folks, we are the draft comes and boom, the season is here before we know it. So it's exciting times that we are, 4, 5, 6 weeks away from rookie camp. And rookie camp means days away from training camp, and then training camp means preseason games, and preseason games mean regular season games. So it's an exciting time. Looking forward to all the coverage here on the channel. It's going to be a little bit different this year. We're not going to be as dialed in on the CFL. We will be still, though, but not producing as much content on the CFL. So we're going to be diving into mostly all Canadian football, of course, but doing a lot of lines, probably doing a lot of BI Raiders and the BCFC. So, of course, you guys will be able to find the weekly show over on the 13th Man football platform. But with that being said, looking forward to this year's draft class because this is kind of what we do now. Canada West football, liking to cover the prospects. The goal hopefully with this would be in 3, 4, 5 years time for these guys to kind of be not household names by the time they're in the CFL, but for people to kind of have an idea of who these guys are and their journeys, their stories. So it's been a fun time, like we said, the prospect series and all that. We just recorded with before we jumped on with JC, Montreal Alouettes receiver Tyson Philpott, University of Calgary alumni, Vanier Cup champion, of course. So he's he's one of them. We talked about him being kind of the tip of the spear at in Canadian prospects, athletes, proving they can play at any level and they belong no matter where they're born, what their passport says. So kind of to put a bow on the CFL Combine, some names that were some interesting ones. Obviously Opie Shinnaby was a running back from University of Alberta who I know there's Jamie Young is watching, or James is watching, friend of the show, and a dad, I guess is the best way to call him, a football dad on Twitter and Instagram. Talked about not knowing who this guy was and him watching Canada West football. Now I do remember Opie Shinnaby kind of getting some carries when Matthew Peterson was down a little bit, and he did show well. Like he did show how well he is, or how much of a big back he was, a powerful back. His explosiveness with running the fastest 40 at this year's combine, and I remember his name because there was a few impressive carries there, but not getting a lot of burn just because of the Matthew Peterson and then just the depth behind him as well. I believe he might have been the 2 or 3 back at U of A this past season, and he comes in the combine and blows up the testing portion on Friday. And I was curious to see, I believe the TSN guys, I don't know if it was the panel of like Lap Elise and Farhan and Naylor and stuff, or if it was Marco Ferguson on the CFL website, but they talked about Oshinabe probably being one of the guys that were going to get, a lot of the workload on the practice day, Saturdays and Sundays. And I was curious to see if he was going to stand out at all. And from the limited coverage that we have been getting, but shout out to the coverage we have been getting. That is not a slight at any of the guys. The like I said, the TSN guys, Marshall Ferguson for CFL.com. I know Christina Marie Constable for the CFL.com as well. She's been putting out some good stuff. CFL Game Sheet, I believe is what it's called on Twitter. Actually, shout out to them. They've been fantastic following them along. And there's been a few others that have been live at the combine tweeting some stuff. And CFL Game Grades, shout out to them. They followed back and have been putting out some good stuff and some good content as well on the combine. And from the combine, helps the CFL, of course, putting out some good clips. But there could have been more. And I was curious to see if Oshinabe was going to be one guy that stood out. And excuse me, he never really didn't really hear much from him in terms of the little written articles from the website and from the TSN. Didn't hear much of his performance from Saturday and Sunday, so I would think it's kind of an unfortunate one where he is a athletic freak, but I'm not too sure if he's going to be valuable on offense. Now he could be an absolute special teams demon where he comes in and is an athletic freak. They look to develop him as a running back, but he can play 4 phases of special teams for you. That's a roster spot, so there is some value within that. I'm curious to see how his draft stock kind of is looked at afterwards. Daniel Weed was another one I was curious to see, and this is kind of the unfortunate thing when you're not able to get a live stream and see all the reps or a good majority of them, and some of them, if they weren't shot on camera, they're going to be missed, or if they're not mentioned, by a certain perspective from if Marshall Ferguson's only watching say Ethan Jordan, he might miss out on Daniel Weeb route, and that's no fault to Marshall Ferguson. That's just on the limited amount of eyes that were there covering and the cameras that were there, to be honest. So and coverage, to be honest, because there was the cameras that were there, and they could have just been with live stream, which would have been great for at least Sunday, even without commentary. I was curious to see if University of Saskatchewan Huskies receiver Daniel Weeb was going to perform well in pads. He tested pretty phenomenally in the agility portions of it, and is a guy that I was able to watch the last 2 seasons at University of Saskatchewan, and was a very impressive receiver at the U Sports level. I was kind of curious on how he would translate to the pro level at the like I said, the testing portion. He looked pretty good and like he belonged. I'm curious if there was any reviews from the combine about Daniel Weeb and good ones. So Daniel Weeb was just another guy that I was kind of curious to watch from Friday's portion. Jeremiah Ojo, another impressive testing freak, and another guy that was mentioned at producing pretty well in the field. So I think it matches up of kind of the athletic testing as well as the eye test, if you will, with Ojo. I think he's another guy that's going to be an interesting prospect. I don't think he is um I don't think he is. He's a tough one because the BC Lions kind of do need some D line help with Sione Tahema possibly missing some games with suspension. But with Christian Covington, Matthew Betts already up there along the defensive line, I don't know if they want to start or look at starting 3 Canadians along there. Although they could play some things with the ratio and bring Covington off the bench. I'm curious how they would look at a prospect like that at pick number 9 is what it would be as of now. Uh, Although it's kind of been talked about at looking at a possible Jackson Finley, and I think he would be there at 9, is maybe a bigger need because of the from an outside perspective more so than in the building. I would say uncertainty of Chris Chapuis. I think everyone that we've talked to in the building is spoke highly of and is getting ready for Chris Chapuis to have a big season as a starting safety for the BC Lions. I'm curious to see how he will perform. So getting into the receivers a little bit more, JC mentioned that it's not as a deep class as we've seen in the past few years. Ethan Jordan maybe leading that in terms of guys that showed up at the combine. I know there's a few other guys that unfortunately, let me try to see if I can bring them up quickly. Aren't coming to name right now, but Ethan Jordan, the guy that we had on the channel, and rooting for him, became a fan of his this past season, or 2 seasons ago, I guess, getting to know who him and Taylor Algersma was at Laurier and what they were doing. And, uh, you know, Ethan Jordan, back-to-back 1,000-yard receiving seasons with playoff games in there as well. I believe it was Hakeem Harris, if I'm not mistaken. University of Davenport was another receiver that has been showing pretty well. Ethan Jordan running a 4.4 40-yard dash time, backing up the speed on tape in real life. So Ethan Jordan's going to be another prospect that we're going to be keeping an eye on and looking forward to seeing. I can't remember. I wanted to talk about a tight end / fullback, and I don't remember if it was this fellow. Give me a second here, folks. I don't think it was him. So I believe it was Quincy Vaughn, who is a Weapon X, if you want to call it that, a Swiss Army knife. Does it all. He's a tight end by title, but he can play fullback, possibly a short yardage option in the CFL. Had been chatted about coming into the combine. If I'm not mistaken, it's Quincy Vaughn. I could be getting that wrong, and I hope I'm not. But he was another guy that I was interested in seeing. Didn't really hear much of him, and it's unfortunate that I don't know how well he's going to be able to perform his abilities and showcase himself. Now, of course, he could perform pretty well in special teams, and that's the unfortunate side of not having much coverage or these guys wanting to highlight, only being able to highlight 3 guys. Special teams is probably going to be washed away and not talked about as much when it comes to these. Now, I did see, I believe, Marshall Ferguson mentioning some of it and stuff like that, so it's not totally out of there, but it's, a portion that we're not going to be able to see, unfortunately, without the coverage. Now, the quarterbacks. The quarterbacks are an interesting one. I have some takes for sure, and let's maybe wait because let's bring up the CFL Draft. order. Hopefully we can do. So, oh, sorry. The quarterbacks. I think this is an interesting one because personally, to me, I think yeah. So let's go ahead and say I don't know if it's a quite a hot take, but when looking at the quarterback prospects this year, we've never seen I don't think two quarterbacks go in the top 30 picks. Let's say. So what I'm going to say coming in here is talking about the quarterback class this year with Taylor Algersma and Curtis Rourke at the top of it. I believe that they're going to be drafted, both of them, in the top 10 this upcoming year in the CFL Draft. I think these prospects are great prospects that we have rarely seen before. Guys like Nathan Rourke and Trey Ford are kind of the first of their kinds in some ways. Of course, there have been others before them, but in some ways, Nathan Rourke kind of the pioneers of the new generation, and Taylor Algersma and Curtis Rourke are the next up. I think they're going to both get their opportunity to go into the NFL and prove that they belong. Now, that being said, I hope I don't sound too negative here, but I do believe that at the end of the day, they probably will both be back in the CFL and playing in the CFL, and I think CFL teams will look at that the same. So where I think they're going to be able to both fall in the top 10, I think there's multiple opportunities for them to find a home. So I'm looking in the first round with calculating in how the picks kind of look as of now. We have Calgary at number 1, Hamilton number 2, BC at number 3, but that's going to be probably lost. Ottawa at number 4, Saskatchewan at number 5, Montreal at 6, Winnipeg at 7, Toronto at 8, BC at number 9, and Hamilton at 10. I think there is multiple opportunities here where where Algersma and Rourke are going to be able to find a home, find one team that believes in drafting them. I think where that starts is at 5 as well with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. You look at the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Is there any immediate needs? And of course, every team would like to fill an immediate need, but looking in the CFL draft, it's kind of as any draft is, a crapshoot, and you're kind of playing the lottery odds, if you will, of not knowing. So when looking at these prospects, of course, they're going to be graded on a curve because they're not going to probably be in the CFL for either 2 to 3 years. Probably is probably more than likely. So you're going to be giving up that when drafting in the first round, which isn't the greatest of things because you want your first round pick to produce or be on the field right away in some capacity. So I think where it starts is at pick number 5 with Saskatchewan Roughriders not really having any apparent needs. Trevor Harris still under contract there for one more season, but is getting up there in age. The roster, I think, is in win now mode where they are trying to go all in right now. So that's where it might be a counter argument if they need to capitalize on this pick at being a contributor somewhere on the team, whether that's special teams or elsewhere. I think a place like Saskatchewan is a great opportunity for one of Curtis Rourke or Taylor Algersma. You look at pick number 6. I think that's another opportunity where fans might kind of look a little bit sideways. Montreal is, in the business of football, and they just kind of proved how maybe cold-hearted to fans and others are, but that's the business of football, of cutting a guy like Cody Fajardo, moving on to a guy like Davis Alexander. Maybe they're going with a guy like Davis Alexander for the next 2 to 3 years, and they look at a can't miss prospect like the one of two of Algersma or Rourke, and they just say, we're so in love with this guy, we have to draft him now. Wait for the future. If Davis is good, then we'll cross that bridge when we get there. I look at pick 7 with a guy like Zach Talaros. And Winnipeg is a tough one because there's some needs on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers where maybe drafting a quarterback is a little bit of a is that kind of the best option right now? But I just come back to now the draft is a weird one where there's the number 1 overall pick and the best prospect. Now usually quarterbacks are hyped up and they're going to be always towards the top, the number 1 overall picks. That's always what happens in the NFL draft. It's a little bit different in the CFL draft, of course, and especially this year with quarterbacks and them getting opportunities down in the NFL, like I said, not being able to see them right away. Winnipeg is an interesting one, but I think of a guy like Zach Collaros on the back half of his career, potentially maybe even his last season upcoming here. Picking a guy like and assuring almost your future, having a guy like Algersma or Rourke, I think in Winnipeg would be smart. Toronto. I think Toronto at number 8 is an interesting one, and maybe even my prediction for where Taylor Algersma will land is at number 8, going to the Toronto Argonauts. Spent his quarterback internship with the Toronto Argonauts, has a relationship in that building with some coaches, quarterback coach, head coach, of course, and some ties within that organization. I think is an interesting one to pay attention to if you're a CFL fan come draft day. So the Toronto Argonauts are an interesting one for me at number 8. I think number 9 is probably unlikely with the BC Lions, and when I say probably, definitely unlikely. That being said, who knows if Calgary might have that pick or not with or I guess the Calgary can't actually have that pick. It'd be 12 that the Lions would possibly lose if they're over the salary cap or the salary cap anymore. Number 9 is for sure the BC Lions. I believe that is very highly unlikely. Number 10 is another interesting one, an Ontario team. Algersma, I believe, spent some more time with them in the quarterback internship as well during his time at Laurier. Could be one to pay attention to, and I think keeping an eye on that as well. I guess to hedge my bet is what I will say. If not 2 quarterbacks are drafted in the top 10, at least one of them will, which maybe isn't as a hot take, but I would pay attention to Saskatchewan at 5, Montreal at 6, Winnipeg at 7, Toronto at number 8, Hamilton Tiger Cats at number 10. And then from on in the second round, I think it's a free-for-all, and they're definitely getting picked within the top 19 picks. I would be pretty stunned if they slid. I know we saw Theo Benedette, Gio Mano, I think, taken towards I want to say Gio was maybe taken towards higher teens, and Theo was taken towards higher 20s, if I'm not mistaken. So with that, the quarterback class is an interesting one. I don't know if anybody noticed, but my eyes definitely rose when he said I'm not sold on Senecal and Desjardins as draftable prospects. Now, of course, they could be camp arms like you mentioned, but I'm curious. Wow, of I thought maybe they would be definitely taken towards maybe the 5th, 8th, 6th, something like that. Later rounds, of course, but at least selected. I'm curious to see what happens with them in the prospect and the process. Excuse me. And to kind of put a bow on things, I think that is everything. Darian Newell is obviously a prospect that I was interested to ask JC about. We had heard that rumblings of him dominating the Saturday portions of practice, and unfortunately not being at practice not too long, like JC said, a legitimate, unfortunate had to leave due to some family circumstances, or just some circumstances. We won't report family circumstances just in case that's not true, but some circumstances he had to leave the combine a little bit early, and from all reports, he was backing up what he did at the University of Buffalo Pro Day. I believe he met with 5 NFL teams, including, of course, the Buffalo Bills, as you can see behind me. So it would be cool. The Buffalo Bills are turning into Canada's team, it appears, with guys like Josh Palmer. Obviously, the last few years, Eli Onku. I forget the other guy's last name. I don't want to butcher him, but he's from the LA Rams, Canadian as well, coming to the Buffalo Bills this upcoming season. It'd be cool to see them maybe take a chance on some of the UDFAs. Maybe a guy like Taylor Algersma backing up Josh Allen. Can you imagine if I had Josh Allen's backup quarterback on the channel, folks? Whew. That would be a cool day for me. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting one come draft season. By the time you guys are seeing this, it's going to be late March, and draft season is April. So April is just around the corner, folks. And we're going to be putting out, by the time you guys are seeing this, we should have our first mock draft out with Shane Ryan at 13th Man Sports. We collaborated on a mock draft together, and of course, as I teased, I don't know if it's earlier, with all these videos blending in together today, or if it was on the episode with Tyson Philpott. If you guys haven't, go check that out because that was a lot of fun. That is already out for sure. Sat down with Tyson Philpott, chatted about his journey. Was a good one. Go check that one out. And we're going to be back shortly, folks. We're going to be having episodes come back out. Mock draft, as I was getting to, the 3 on mock draft is only a few weeks away. So fun times here on the Canadian Football Fanatics. Be sure to leave a like down below, comment on the video, comment a question for JC when he comes on next time, comment a question down below for myself. And most importantly, of course, Subscribe, folks. When you guys subscribe, press the notification bell. You guys will get notified every single time we go live, upload any sort of content here on the channel, upload any sort of YouTube short, a video, go live like I mentioned. You guys will get a notification, a little ping to your phone and or laptop, iPad, whatever you're watching the Canadian Football Fanatics on these days. Hopefully it's everything. Subscribe. Make sure you guys are on the YouTube. If you guys are on Xbox watching on the big TV, we guys appreciate you guys, but make sure you guys are subscribed on all platforms. We are chasing down, I believe, 2.5K on Instagram, and we're still slacking behind on subscribers. So please, folks, subscribe. I believe the percentages that they don't lie. When I get them on the YouTube studio, I get a little notification every month. 75% of people that are tuning in and consuming our content are still remaining unsubscribed. 75% of people. So please do us a favor, folks. Subscribe to the channel. It'd be greatly, greatly appreciated. Leave a like. Follow us on all social media platforms. You guys can find us on Instagram at Canadian Football Fanatics, on Twitter at _CF Fanatics. And that's going to do it for another video, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.